You know how sometimes in movies the villain, flips the script
Yeah.
and ends up kind of helping the good guys?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It's a classic twist, right?
Totally.
Well, today, we're diving into a legal maneuver that's even more surprising.
Ooh.
And it all comes down to this thing called Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 35.
Okay.
And trust me, this isn't some boring, dusty old legal textbook stuff.
Right.
We're talking second chances, secret loopholes, the power of, cutting a deal.
Right.
And all of this is wrapped up in this one rule that can, completely change the game for someone facing a criminal sentence.
Absolutely. And it really does have that, that cloak and dagger vibe to it sometimes. You're right. On the surface, Rule 35 might seem pretty straightforward, but there are these two sides to it that make it really fascinating.
Right.
Like a coin.
Okay.
One side is all about fixing those obvious errors in sentencing.
Yeah.
Like the legal version of a typo.
I got you.
But then you flip that coin over and you've got Rule 35B, where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Because it's all about rewarding cooperation, and that's where you get those, crazy, movie-worthy plot twists.
So let's start with the typo side of things then.
Okay.
Rule 35A. It's kind of like a legal safety net, would you say?
Yeah, exactly.
If a judge makes a mistake during sentencing, they can sort of hit the undo button, right?
Exactly. And it's got to be a quick fix, too.
Yeah.
We're talking like a 14-day sprint to get things right.
Oh, wow.
Imagine the stress for someone who's just been sentenced,
Oh, yeah.
only to find out there was a miscalculation or a technical error.
Yeah.
Rule 35A swoops in and says, hold on, we need to get this right.
That makes total sense, right? I mean, you wouldn't want someone's life hanging in the balance just because of a simple math mistake or something.
Right, exactly.
But I got to admit, the cooperation for leniency side of Rule 35, the B part,
Yeah.
sounds way more interesting.
Yeah. Oh, it definitely has that, kind of cloak and dagger vibe to it.
Yeah.
Think of it this way. A defendant decides to, spill the beans.
Uh-huh.
They offer up some crucial information that helps the government, crack a bigger pace.
Right.
And that's where this idea of substantial assistance comes in.
Okay.
It's the, golden ticket to a possible sentence reduction.
So it's like a legal bargaining chip.
Exactly.
They trade intel for a chance at a lighter sentence.
Precisely. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
The government typically has 1 year after sentencing to file a motion based on, the defendant's help. But get this, there are certain situations where they can actually make that move even years later.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah.
So it's like a delayed reward system.
Yeah, you could say that.
So you could cooperate years after your sentence and still get a break.
You got it. Let's say someone gives the feds some info.
Yeah.
But it's like a puzzle piece, right? And it just doesn't fit until, much later. Maybe a new case pops up.
Yeah.
Or some new evidence emerges.
Right.
And then suddenly their information becomes the, missing link.
Wow.
Boom, Rule 35B comes back into play.
So that's what I call a second chance. But wouldn't that be a bit of a gamble for the defendant? I mean,
No.
How do they know if their info will actually be useful down the road?
It's definitely, a high-stakes game, no doubt about it.
Yeah.
But here's the kicker.
Okay.
The court isn't just looking at the help they provided, before sentencing.
Right.
They can actually factor in any assistance the defendant gives, even after they're behind bars.
So it's not just about, cutting a deal during the trial.
Right.
They can keep racking up those, good deeds even from prison.
Exactly. And here's where Rule 35B takes a really wild turn.
Okay.
In some cases, and we're talking really exceptional situations here,
Yeah.
a judge can actually reduce a sentence below the statutory minimum.
Hold on. Are you telling me they can get a sentence lighter than what the law actually requires?
You could say that. It really shows you how much weight the courts put on cooperation.
Yeah.
But of course, with that kind of power comes a ton of legal debate and complexity.
Right, because you got to draw the line somewhere.
Yeah.
Speaking of complex cases, you mentioned United States v. Tadio earlier.
Uh-huh.
Is that a prime example of how this rule plays out in real life?
It's a textbook case, really. Dennis Tadio was convicted and sentenced, but then he kind of did a complete 180
Okay.
and started cooperating with the government, providing some really valuable information. Naturally, the government filed a motion under Rule 35B to get his sentence reduced.
Places.
But here's the twist. The judge in Tadio's case, they decided to look beyond just the facts of his cooperation.
Okay.
They kind of took into account other things,
Like what?
like his personal circumstances
Mm-hmm.
and his, overall character.
So, trying to get a fuller picture.
Yeah, painting a fuller picture of, who he was as a person.
That seems fair, but I can see how that could, lead to some problems, legally speaking.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Some people argued that the court went too far by considering anything beyond Tadio's cooperation.
Okay.
They said Rule 35B is, very specific.
Yeah.
It's all about the assistance provided, period.
So like sticking to the letter of the law versus like taking a more, I don't know, holistic view.
Exactly. And this case actually ended up going all the way to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals.
Wow.
And their decision, well, it kind of sent shockwaves through the legal world.
Okay, what did they decide?
They sided with the judge.
Really?
Yeah, they basically said, yes, substantial assistance is, like, the key.
Yeah.
That unlocks the door to a Rule 35B motion.
Okay.
But judges have some leeway to consider the bigger picture when they're deciding how much to actually reduce a sentence.
So it's not just a cold, hard calculation.
Yeah.
There's room for, I don't know, a human touch.
That's the idea. The Ninth Circuit actually pointed out that the rule uses the word may, which gives courts the power to grant a sentence reduction, but also the flexibility to consider other relevant factors.
So every case is different.
Exactly. The ruling was all about finding that balance between, rewarding cooperation,
Right.
but also making sure the punishment actually fits the crime, taking all the pieces into account.
So what does the Tadio case mean for other people who are hoping to get a break under Rule 35B?
Well, it set a pretty significant precedent, at least within the Ninth Circuit.
Okay.
It made it clear that judges have the authority to look beyond just the cooperation itself
Yeah.
and consider other factors that might give a more complete picture of the defendant's situation.
So it's not a, get-out-of-jail-free card,
Right.
but it shows that judges can be flexible.
Absolutely. Substantial assistance is still the main thing.
Yeah.
But Tadio demonstrated that judges, aren't robots. They can use their discretion and consider the broader context,
Yeah.
which could be a real game changer for certain defendants.
Wow. So we started with Rule 35A,
Yeah.
those quick fixes,
Yeah.
and now we've explored all the ins and outs of Rule 35B, where cooperation can literally change someone's future.
It's really amazing how this one rule can have such a huge impact, isn't it?
It really is.
It really highlights the power of second chances
Yeah.
and just how complicated the justice system can be.
Yeah, and it really makes you think, about how this rule, it's just words on paper, but it can have such a huge impact in the real world.
It's so true. It's easy to forget that when you get all caught up in the technicalities of it all.
Right.
But Rule 35 really does bring it all back to the human element, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that the justice system, it's not just about punishment, It's about seeking the truth.
Right.
It's about encouraging people to be accountable for their actions.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think, finding ways to, set things right.
And sometimes doing the right thing. Well, it means taking a chance, right?
Yeah.
Even when it feels like a total long shot.
Yeah.
Like those people who decide to cooperate, hoping that their information, it'll eventually make a difference somehow.
It takes a lot of courage to come forward like that.
It really does.
Especially when you're already facing the consequences of what you did.
Yeah.
But Rule 35, it offers this, glimmer of hope, like this possibility that by helping others, well, you might just end up helping yourself, too.
It's a powerful incentive.
It is.
And what I find really interesting is how Rule 35 gives judges that power,
Yeah.
to look beyond just what's on the surface, to actually consider the individual circumstances and really weigh the different factors that might, make them lean towards leniency.
It's a tough balancing act, though, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, on one hand, you want to reward genuine cooperation,
Right.
give people a chance to redeem themselves.
But then on the other hand, you have to make sure that justice is actually being served,
Right.
that the punishment fits the crime,
Yeah.
and that the system, isn't being manipulated in any way.
It's such a good point, and it makes me wonder, this whole idea of a reduced sentence, as well-intentioned as it is.
Right.
Could it maybe lead to, I don't know, false testimonies or people exaggerating their role in a crime just to try and get a lighter sentence?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And it's one that legal experts and policymakers, they're constantly debating.
Yeah.
It's like you're trying to walk this tightrope
Right.
between encouraging cooperation,
Yeah.
but also protecting the integrity of the entire system.
Yeah, you're always going to have that risk. Right?
Yeah, the potential for abuse is always there.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to have those clear guidelines in place and a really strong judicial process.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive into the whole world of Rule 35.
We've talked about, the power of this rule, from fixing those little errors to potentially completely reshaping someone's future through cooperation.
Yeah.
So what's the one thing you'd want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the biggest thing to remember is that the legal system, even with all its complexities, it's ultimately about people.
Yeah.
And Rule 35, I think, is a perfect example of that. It shows us that second chances really are possible.
Yeah.
That cooperation, it can be this incredibly powerful force for good. And that justice, well, it's not always so black and white.
I like that. Well said.
Thank you.
It's been great diving into this with you.
Yeah, this was fun.
And for our listeners out there, we'll leave you with this. Does the possibility of getting a reduced sentence under Rule 35, does that actually encourage real cooperation? Or could it accidentally lead to, more manipulation?
It's a good question.
It's a question that really goes to the heart of our justice system. And I think it's one that deserves a lot more thought and consideration.
Absolutely.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive.